All right. So I'm going to put this other one in, battery holder, and then I'll move on to some of the more complex items here. And so I'll reset this. I'm not going to hook up the electronics yet, like the speed controller, but I will mount the motor and a couple other things. So I'm going to need to clean up some of these parts because we're talking about the side panels, the armor plate, and some of the detail items, and I need to make sure that those are all cleaned up, and some of the extra plastic that you get when you trim these off of here is off and smooth, so I'll sand that, but I'm not going to videotape it. Alright. Alright, so one of the things I forgot was actually the side skirts on this vehicle are metal, which is pretty cool. You can see some of the detail etching pieces that go along with it. Again, big fan of this kit thus far. Well worth the expense. I think the quality that's gone into the engineering of this is pretty incredible. This should be pretty straightforward as far as mounting these. Should prove interesting when it comes to painting. It looks, these are aluminum side skirts. Just some small rubber bands attaching them together. Already pre-drilled. And so we talked about when we were doing this originally, whoops, that's of course backwards, about the importance of the side pieces. Sorry, I just realized I had moved that outside the field. So the importance of these side pieces with the screws in them, or the nuts that have been epoxied in them, and that's because that's how you're going to attach these plates. Again, you know, kind of a little history with this stuff. Because, you know, they were looking for range and speed and a certain amount of stealth with the vehicle, they couldn't load it up with a lot of heavy armor as much as they'd like to. It seemed like, especially Hitler, anything that seemed successful, they just kept on putting bigger and bigger guns. This later in the war was really no different. Having put anti-tank pieces, I think the PAC-30 was what they put on the top of it. Don't quote me on that, but it was they had an anti-tank roll for it as well. But in this case, so the compromise was, how do they achieve some sort of ability to protect the crew without making this thing into a tank, because now they're back, it's no longer good for surveillance. It's not going to have the speed necessary or the you know, the range necessary to do that scouting mission that they needed in the German armored corps of the war. Oops, fell right back off until she screwed on. So the compromise was what you see here, which is these angled holes. I'll leave that off for a minute. Put this over here. So is these the angled hole that you see here, and what this does, that we learned again in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's why a lot of our vehicles have this design to them, is that if you hit a mine, the idea is that it's the shape chart. The shape would diffuse some of the explosion instead of having a flat, totally flat bottom area. Or if you know, one of the wheels were to go over it, again, same type of thing. Explosion down, explosion out. The other thing is that you'll see once the structure, and you can see it in the in the finished pictures of it, there's a lot of angles on this vehicle, and the angles were there again to deflect incoming rounds as much as they could. You know, it's some of this is not going to be successful in totally deflecting the explosions or even the anti-tank rounds. So I'll put one side in so it doesn't keep on falling off there. You can see all of this lines up pretty well, so we'll attach it in the rear here. So I'm just going to put in one each just so that it can hold it in place while I work on some of the other components. And my guess is I'm going to have to move some things around a little bit in order to get the fit just right, because it looks like, can't see it, but it looks like if my initial placement for this piece, I may have put it a little bit too far forward, so I'm going to loosen up the front. There we go. And again, like I said, this is where you're going to have to do a little bit of work with it in order to get it to line up correctly. All right, so we've got those on initially. The next part that we have to do is we're putting the rest of the structure pieces. So the last of the structure pieces is the other support for the side armor that goes in front of your servo. So the reason why they leave this off is it would have been pretty difficult, I would say, to have done this with, as far as attaching this piece prior to putting in the servo tray or putting in the linkage. This first one, really no impact to it whatsoever. This will be one of the ones that I will, when I put it in, I will actually use a little bit of Loctite on it, just because it's so integral to the entire chassis, and there'll be really no reason for me to remove these pieces in the future. I can access everything I need. If I have to do suspension work, I can do it pretty much, or steering geometry. I can access these just by removing these two battery ends, and I can slide the servo tray out now that it's all together. The one thing that'll be difficult, and you can see it here, is this servo arm. However, if you get one of these Chapman tools, the nice thing that it has is this ratchet end. So if I had to remove that piece in that tight spot, I would just go ahead and put this on here, stick it in here, and loosen that off of the arm. The other thing I can do is I could just go ahead and remove from the ball joint here, from the trunnion. I can take this screw out, take those two screws, and I can slide the entire servo mechanism out of the vehicle. So not really that big of an issue. So when I did this one originally, when I put in this support, which is what the other one I'm putting in, I had a little bit of struggle because it's kind of a tight space there. So there's, you probably can't see it, but here, and then on these bottoms here, a nut goes in there, and holding all that stuff in place is not the easiest thing to do. And they're opposite. On these ones, there doesn't clearly seem to be a front and a back to these supports. Let me just check that. But what I will do is I'll make it look just like it is in the diagram. Alright, and it looks like, so the front, it would open, the bottoms open towards the front. What I'm talking about here is where the nuts slide in. So this end is open, this end is closed. And this additional bow we're putting in, it appears that it also points open towards the front, so it would be going the same direction. Not sure what would happen if you mount it the other way, but so I'll just, like I said, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to put these in. Open end towards the front of the vehicle, bumper being the front of the vehicle. Part of the challenge with these is manipulating. You have to set the nuts in correctly so that it lines up. Really only goes in one way. It's not helping because my needle nose pliers are slightly magnetized, so very light. There we go. Nut, and you got to kind of manipulate it until it just falls into the slot. Again, this is just something that I want to do. They don't even have it as a recommendation, probably just because they're using these fine machine screws. There's the second one. I had the nut fall out of the little little part of the support column where it wasn't really fit in there. This was the one I had a difficult time getting in to begin with. Let me move this out of the way so you can see what I'm doing. So there we go. So you want to be careful when you're holding this, because right now it's just those end pieces that are securing currently securing this armor, or these side skirts. So they're also carrying the weight. So try not to lift it solely by the side skirts. So all of these supports that you can see here, there's a nut in the bottom, nut in the top. I just got to go through and do that same thing with it. I will Loctite these because once I've got them in there, I really don't want them backing out. Per each bow, there's 4 of them. So we'll need 8 of these screws to finish this off. There we go, we got 8 of them. 8 of the nuts and 8 of the screws. Like I said, I'm going to actually Loctite these in. And so this is going to require a little bit of manipulation. So I won't tighten them all down at first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place these in here. I'll get the screws in place, and then I'll move it around in order to get where I need to be as far as getting everything to line up. So again, like I said, I'm trying to avoid down the road having one of these come out, because when it comes out it'll have been painted and weathered when I'm done. I really don't want to have to you know, put another one in, one of these machine screws. My intent is to make these machine screws invisible in the final product. As you can see, this can be a little bit frustrating. Alright, so after much wrestling with this, I was able to get all of this to line up. Really, it really was just loosening everything up and, you know, pushing these things around a bit so they would line up. The very small fasteners just added to the complexity. So there's 2 per side there, 2 on the bottom, and so that's the finished product. So what I would say is really terrific job. The panel lines are very, very, very tight. Originally I was thinking I was going to have to seal part of this, not that I'm going to be running it through water, but it, you know, grass or whatever could get wet. But the panels are really tight. The primer that I'll use on this, probably an etching primer, will an epoxy etching primer will fill most of that in. So I'm not I mean, just hairline openings. Of course, you know, the bigger issue are these, and I'm going to create probably some sort of for these openings, I'll make a boot of some sort, probably made out of a cloth, a nylon or something like that, to look like canvas or leather. But yeah, overall, very nice. It's very rigid. Nothing is moving on this thing now. It is, once you tie in all these sides here, it becomes really stiff. So next thing on the plate here is this. This is their 540 size motor. You can use any motor. I just, for ease, I got it off their site. It looks like good quality motor. It already has the ends on it. So we'll go ahead and install this. You just have to install the pinion. And again, you're using, you have to make sure that for the gears to mesh appropriately, it's got to be the correct amount of distance between the pinion and the gear. Alright, so part of the reason why I'm doing this is so you guys can avoid some of the problems and some of the issues that I've done. So, what you see here is the motor mount that attaches it to the gearbox. See all the gray area there? That's me rebuilding what I broke off because I over tightened it when I was installing it. So don't do that. Just make it snug. There's 3 of them there. Notice that in the actual manual it shows you how you're supposed to, the depth of the pinion from the end bell. Make sure that's correct, and then do not over tighten these. But if you do, and I contacted Xion. I'm going to pay for a replacement part for it. But until then, because I want to get this thing up and running, I have built my own. So what I used was some JB Weld, and I made a mold of it, and I grafted it on there. It's an epoxy. I used not like a oven that you'd cook in, but just a regular one for parts and stuff. Heated to 200 degrees in the mold. Then I used a router. I used an end bit on a milling machine and a Dremel to carve this out. Transferred the dimensions off the back of the gearbox here so that it would line up, and it works. So here's another thing, another trick that'll save you time. It shows you in the manual, and if you notice from the other video, it's not as far together as it was in the last video, and that's because I had to take it back apart. So this other support that goes here, you have to have the motor in before you can put that support in, and that also means that you have to remove the servo tray before you can put that in as well. I think where I put that, I may have moved that out of the work area at the moment. But just keep that in mind, because the way the instructions are done is it is an exploded view. It doesn't say to do this before you do this. It just shows you it all together and expects you to figure it out. And I'm sure most people, common sense wise, would have figured it out. However, I for some reason went down the other path, which was to put in the other two pieces before I put in the motor, which was a mistake. So what I'm going to do is I'll mount this back on here, this new mount that I made. This time I'll make sure that I don't tighten it down like I did the last one, and that way I can do the break-in for some of the gear stuff, because I'd like to make sure I got steering angles and all that correct, and I can always pull all this stuff back off if I need to. Alright, so don't be me. Learn how to do this from this video, so that you don't have to undo everything that I just did, because putting these supports and getting the armor pieces to line up was not the easiest thing I did. It took a lot of manipulating, and now I've got to go back and do it all over again. Alright? Hope this helps. So I want to point out a couple things here that are different. So last time I did this, I had the issue with this piece fracturing. I tried to make it out of a mold. It didn't work so well. Got another one from Germany. The other problem is, on the instructions, it has the installation of the servo box, the servo, prior to putting on the motor. And I'll let you know right now, impossible. The way this sits on here, there's just not enough clearance to get this in, and you need to make sure that this is meshing correctly with the motor there. So what I would say to do first is attach the motor to the gearbox, and then put on the servo retainer, and then the other body plate, which sits on top of this here. It slides in. So I thought I would show you how much of a tight fit this actually is. As I said, you could see I had originally installed the servo on there and had to take it back off in order to install the motor on there. So if you can see, it matches, the bell housing here will match exactly on the gearbox. So it's a pretty exact fit. So here's another thing I want to point out is, if you look right here,
you won't be able to get this to seat right unless you have the clearances correct on the bolts here. I thought I had it correct by the diagram that's on here. But as you can see, it'll never seat fully down in there, so what you'll have to do is just loosen this up. And I think what I'm going to have to do is readjust the holes I'm using for this. See if I can just shift it up a little bit. That seems to do it. So, and it shouldn't cause any other clearance issues, I would suspect. So it shows in the diagram like this, clocked all the way out like this. If you push it up just a smidge, it will allow just enough. All right. So here's how we'll do this. It's kind of tight fit even when you remove the servo. Being conscious of how the gear clocks in there. So since this one out here is the tightest one, I'll just do that one first. I'm just going to start it up. I'm not going to snug it. One of the things you want to make sure of is the first one I broke evidently because I tightened it too much. Peter, the creator of this kit at Xion Models, he says that it has to be plastic to insulate for vibration. I would disagree. This is no different than any other bell housing on any other either RC or a real engine, and aluminum would be fine. And in fact, that's what I plan on milling a replacement piece that would be done in aluminum. This piece is what we're talking about right here, this plastic piece. So, because I think just over time it's going to get brittle and eventually break. So I'll put the rest of these in, and then we'll put the servo back on. So I wanted to show you guys something having to do with the way this sets up. So I actually had to make a slight change. I reversed so the leads are on the other side so they're not binding up with the servo. But so we're going to talk about something here, the gear mesh between the main gear on the motor and the gear in the gearbox. If you have this adjusted too far up, what do I mean by up? Meaning you're forcing the gear down into the main gear. So notice that gap there. When you go to put it on, you will only be able to get one of the three mount points to line up. No matter what you do, you can't get it in there. So if you actually do as it shows in here and adjust it all the way up, when you slide this on, the lash, the gear between the gears, which is just the amount of space between it, it fits in there perfectly, and now the bell housing and the gearbox line up.